Hello, and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we continue our reading of Between Planets by Robert Heinlein. Our protagonist, Don, has, after great consideration and not a little argument, surrendered his mysterious ring to the Venusian dragon, Sir Isaac Newton. Chapter 16, Multum in Parvo. Much from a little. Donald looked at Isabel and found her still solemn, unsmiling, but she seemed to show approval. Her father sat down heavily in the other chair. "Phew," he sighed. "Mr. Harvey, you are a hard nut. You had me worried." "I'm sorry, I had to think. No matter now." He turned to Sir Isaac. "I guess I'd better dig up Phipps, yes?" "It won't be necessary." The voice came from behind them. They all turned, all but Sir Isaac, who did not need to turn his body. Phipps stood just inside the door. "I came in on the tail end of your remark, Jim. If you want me, I'm here." "Well, yes. Just a moment, then. I came for another reason." He faced Don. "Mr. Harvey, I owe you an apology." "Oh, that's all right. No, let me have my say. I had no business trying to bullyrag you into cooperating. Don't mistake me. We want that ring. We must have it. And I meant to argue about it until we got it. But I've been under great strain, and I went about it the wrong way. A very great strain. That's my only excuse." "Well," said Don, "come to think about it, so have I. So let's forget it." He returned to his host. "Sir Isaac, may I?" He reached towards Sir Isaac's handling tentacles, pulled out his palm, and the ring dropped into it. He turned and handed it to Phipps. Phipps stared at it stupidly for a moment. When he looked up, Don was surprised to see that the man's eyes were filled with tears. "I won't say thank you," he said, "because when you see what will come of this, it will mean more to you than any person's thanks. What is in this ring is of life and death importance to many, many people. You'll see." Don was embarrassed by the man's naked emotions. "I can guess," he said gruffly. "Mr. Costello told me that it meant bomb protection and faster ships, and I bet on my hunch that you people and I are on the same side in the long run. I just hope I didn't guess wrong." "Guess wrong? No, you haven't guessed wrong, and not just in the long run, as you put it, but right now. Now we have this." He held up the ring. "We stand a fighting chance to save our people on Mars." "Mars?" repeated Don. "Hey, wait a minute. What's this about Mars? Who's going to be saved, and from what?" Phipps looked just as puzzled. "Eh? But wasn't that what persuaded you to turn over the ring?" "Wasn't what persuaded me?" "Didn't Jim Costello—" "Why, I thought of course you had—" And Sir Isaac's voter interrupted with, "Gentlemen, apparently it was assumed that—" "Quiet!" Don shouted. As Phipps opened his mouth again, Don hurriedly added, "Things seem to have gotten mixed up again. Can somebody, just one of you, tell me what goes on?" Costello could, and did. The organization had for many years been quietly building a research center on Mars. It was the one place in the system where the majority of humans were scientists. The Federation maintained merely an outpost there with a skeleton garrison. Mars was not regarded as being of any real importance, just a place where harmless longhairs could dig among the ruins and study the customs of an ancient and dying race. The security officers of the IBI gave Mars little attention. There seemed no need. The occasional agent who did show up could be led around and allowed to see research of no military importance. The group on Mars did not have the giant facilities available on Earth, the mastodonic cybernetic machines, the unlimited sources of atomic power, the super-powerful particle accelerators, the enormous laboratories. But they did have freedom. The theoretical groundwork for new advances in physics had been worked out on Mars, spurred on by certain mystifying records of the First Empire, that almost mythical earlier epoch when the solar system had been one political unit. Don was warmly pleased to hear that his parents' researches had contributed largely at this point in the problem. It was known, or so the ancient Martian records seem to state, that the ships of the First Empire had traveled between the planets not in journeys of weary months or even weeks, but of days. The descriptions of these ships and of their motive power were extensive, but differences in language, in concept, and in technology created obstacles enough to give comparative semanticists nervous breakdowns. Had done so, in fact. A treatise on modern electronics, written in Sanskrit poetry with half the thoughts taken for granted, would have been lucid in comparison. It had simply been impossible to make fully intelligible translation of the ancient records. What was missing had to be worked out by genius and sweat. When the theoretical work had been carried as far as it could be, the problem was sent to Earth via members of the organization for sub-rosa testing and for conversion of theory into present-day engineering. At first, there was a steady traffic of information back and forth between planets. But as the secret grew, the members of the organization were less and less inclined to travel for fear of compromising what they knew. By the time of the Venus crisis, it had been standard practice for some years to send critical information by couriers who knew nothing and therefore could not talk, such as Don, or by non-terrestrials who were physically immune to the interrogation methods of the security police. Giving a Venetian dragon the third degree was not only impractical but ridiculous. For different but equally obvious reasons, Martians, too, were safe from the thought police. Don himself was a last-minute choice, a channel of opportunity. The Venus crisis had rushed things. How badly it had rushed things, no one knew until after the Commodore Higgins' spectacular raid on Circumterra. The engineering data so urgently needed on Mars had gone to Venus instead, there to be lost, Don's half of it, in the confusion of rebellion and counterblow. The rebelling colonists, driving toward the same goal as the organization, had unknowingly thwarted their own best chance for overthrowing the Federation. Communication between the organization members on Venus, on Earth, and on Mars had been precariously and imperfectly reestablished right under the noses of the Federation police. The organization had members working for IT&T on all three planets, members such as Costello. Costello himself had been helped to make his escape with Isabel because he knew too much. They could not afford to have him questioned. But a new drop box had been set up on Governor's Island in the person of a Federation Communications technical sergeant. The channel to the sergeant was a dragon who had the garbage disposal contract for the New Greenie base. The dragon had no voter, the sergeant knew no whistle talk, but a tentacle can pass a note to a human hand. Communication, though difficult and dangerous, was possible. Travel between planets for members of the organization was now utterly impossible. The only commercial line as yet reestablished was the Earth-Moon run. The group on Venus was attempting the almost impossible task of completing a project all preliminary preparations for which had been made on Mars. The task was not quite impossible, provided they could find the missing half of the message. They might yet outfit a ship, send it to Mars, and finish the job. So they hoped, and continued to hope until recently, when disastrous news had gotten through to them from Earth. The organization had been penetrated on Earth. A very senior member, one who knew too much, had been arrested and had not been able to suicide in time. And a task force of Federation ships was already on its way to attack the group on Mars. "Wait a minute," Don interrupted. "I thought, Mr. Costello, didn't you tell me back in New London that the Federation already had moved in on Mars?" "Not exactly. I told you that I had inferred that the Federation had taken over Schiaparelli Station, the IT&T branch there. And so they had, to the extent of censoring all traffic and putting a stop to all traffic with Venus. They could do that with a squad of soldiers from the pint-sized garrison they always have there, but this is an attack in force. They mean to liquidate the organization." Liquidate the organization. Don translated the jawbreakers into real words. Kill all the people who were against them. That meant his parents. He shook his head to clear it. The thought did not mean anything to him inside. It had been too many years. He could not see their faces. He could not imagine them dead. He wondered if he himself had become dead inside, unable to feel things. No matter, something had to be done. What do we do? How can we stop it? We quit wasting time, answered Phipps. We've lost half a day already. Sir Isaac? Yes, my friend, let us hurry. The room was a laboratory shop, but of dragon proportions. It needed to be, for it held a round dozen dragons as well as 50-odd men and women. Everyone who could manage it wanted to see the opening of the ring. Even Maleth Dathan was there, sitting up in his cell, and with the aid of his power-driven corset, and with the colors of emotion rippling gently across his frail body. Don and Isabel had climbed to the top of the entrance ramp where they could see without being in the way. Opposite them was a large stereo tank, lighted but with no picture growing in it. Below them was a micromanipulator, dragon style. Other pieces of apparatus and power tools filled the rest of the room. They were strange to Don, not because they were of dragon construction and for dragon use, for many of them were not. They were strange in the way in which laboratory equipment is always exotic to the layman. He was used to dragon artifacts. The two technologies, human and dragon, had interpenetrated sufficiently that a human, especially one living on Venus, found nothing odd in joints that were wrung instead of welded or bolted, nothing unusual in interlocking ovoids where a man would use screws. Sir Isaac was at the micromanipulator, his tendrils at the controls. Down over his head fitted a frame with 8 eyepieces. He touched the control rack, the tank rippled, and a picture built in it, the ring in full color and 3 dimensions. It seemed to be about 8 feet across. The boss of the ring faced out, displaying the enamel-filled initial cut into it, a capital H framed with a simple circle of white enamel. The picture flickered and changed. Only a portion of the initial was now visible, but so greatly magnified that the enamel rubbed into a shallow groove of the letter that looked like broken paving. The picture flickered and changed. Only a portion of the initial was now visible, but so greatly magnified that the enamel rubbed into the shallow grooves of the letter looked like broken paving blocks. A shadowy pointed cylinder, out of focus save at its very end, moved across the picture. A great oily globe formed on the end of it, detached itself, and settled on the enamel. The paving blocks started to break up. Montgomery Phipps climbed the ramp, saw Don and Isabel, and sat down on the edge beside them. He seemed to want to be friendly. "This'll be something to tell your grandchildren about," he remarked. "Old Sir Ike at work, best microtechnician in the system, can darn near pick out a single molecule, make it sit up and beg." "It surprises me," Don admitted. "I hadn't known that Sir Isaac was a laboratory technician." "He's more than that. He's a great physicist. Hasn't the significance of his chosen name struck you?" Don felt foolish. He knew how dragons went about picking vocalized names, but he took such names for granted, just as he took his own Venusian name for granted. "His whole tribe tends to be scientific," Phipps went on. "There's a grandson who calls himself Galileo Galilei. Have you met him? And there's a Dr. Einstein and a Madame Curie, and there's an integrating chemist who calls herself, egg alone knows why, Little Buttercup. But old Sir Ike is the boss man, the top brain. He made a trip to Earth to help with some of the work on this project. But you knew that, didn't you?" Donald admitted he had not known why Sir Isaac was on Earth. Isabel put in, "Mr. Phipps, if Sir Isaac was working on this on Earth, why doesn't he know what was in the ring before he opened it?" "Well, he does and he doesn't. He's worked on the theoretical end. But what we will find, unless we get a terrific disappointment, will be detailed engineering instructions worked out for man-type tools and techniques. Very different." Don thought about it. Engineering and science were more or less lumped together in his mind. He lacked the training to appreciate the enormous difference. He changed the subject. "You're a laboratory man yourself, Mr. Phipps?" Me? Heavens no, my fingers are all thumbs. The dynamics of history is my game. Theoretical once, applied now. Well, that's a dry hole. His eyes were on the tank. The solvent, juiced in by what seemed to be hogshead amounts, had washed the enamel out of the groove that defined part of the initial H. The floor of the groove could be seen, bare, amber, and transparent. Phipps stood up. I can't sit still. I get nervous. Excuse me, please. Surely. A dragon was lumbering up the ramp. He stopped by them just as Phipps was turning away. Howdy, Mr. Phipps. Mind if I park here? Not at all. Know these people? I've met the lady. Don acknowledged the introductions, giving both his names, and received those of the dragon in turn. Refreshing Rain and Josephus. Just call me Joe. Joe was the first dragon other than Sir Isaac whom Don had met there, who was voter-trained and equipped. Don looked at him with interest. One thing was certain. Joe had learned English from some master other than the nameless Cockney who had taught Sir Isaac. A Texan. John felt quite certain of it. I'm honored to be in your house, Don said to him. The dragon settled himself comfortably, letting his chin come about to their shoulders. Not my house. These snobs wouldn't have me round there if it wasn't a job I can do a little better than the next hombre. I just work here. Oh. Don wanted to defend Sir Isaac against the charge of snobbery, but taking sides between dragons seemed unwise. He looked back at the tank. The scan had shifted to the circle of enamel which framed the H. 15 or 20 degrees of it appeared in the tank. The magnification started to swell enormously until one tiny sector filled the huge picture. Again the solvent floated into the enamel. Again it washed away. Now we're getting someplace, maybe, commented Joe. The enamel was dissolving like snow in spring rain, but instead of washing down to a bare floor, something dark was revealed under the paint. A bundle of steel pipes, it seemed to be, nestled in the shallow groove. There was dead silence, then somebody cheered. Don found he had been holding his breath. What is it? He asked Joe. Wire, what would you expect? Sir Isaac stepped up the magnification and shifted to another sector. Slowly, as carefully as a mother bathing her firstborn, he washed the covering off the upper layer of the coiled wire. Presently, a microscopic claw reached in, felt around most delicately, and extracted one end. Joe got to his feet. Gotta get to work, he keyed. That's my cue. He ambled down the ramp. Don noticed that he was growing a new starboard midships leg, and the process was not quite complete. It gave him a lopsided one-flat-wheel gait. Slowly, tenderly, the wire was cleaned and uncoiled. More than an hour later, the tiny hands of the micromanipulator stretched out their prize. 4 feet of steel wire so gossamer fine that it could not be seen at all by naked eye, even by a dragon. Sir Isaac backed his head out of the eyepiece rack. Is Maleth's wire ready? He inquired. All set. Very well, my friends, let us commence. They were fed into 2 ordinary microwire speakers rigged in parallel. Seated at a control panel for synchronizing the fragmented message latent in the 2 wires was a worried-looking man wearing earphones, Mr. Costello. The steel spider threads started very slowly through, and a high-pitched gabbling came out of the horn. There were very rapid momentary interruptions, like high-frequency code. Not in sync, announced Mr. Costello. Rewind. An operator sitting in front of him said, I hate to rewind, Jim. These wires would snap if you breathed on them. So you break a wire. Sir Isaac will splice it. Rewind. Maybe you've got one in backwards. Shut up and rewind. Presently the gabbling resumed. To Don it sounded the same as before and utterly meaningless, but Mr. Costello nodded. That's it. Was it recorded from the beginning? Don heard Joe's Texas accents answering, In the can. Okay, keep it rolling and start playing back the recording. Try slowing down the composite 20 to 1. Costello threw a switch. The gabbling stopped completely, although the machines continued to unreel the invisible threads. Shortly, a human voice came out of the loudspeaker horn. It was deep, muffled, dragging, and almost unintelligible. Joe stopped it and made an adjustment, started over. When the voice resumed, it was a clear, pleasant, most carefully enunciated contralto. Title, the voice said, Some Notes on the Practical Applications of the Horst-Milne Equations. Table of Contents, Part 1, on the Design of Generators to Accomplish Strain-Free Molar Translation. Part 2, the Generation of Spacetime Discontinuities, Closed, Open, and Folded. Part 3, on the Generation of Temporary Pseudo-Acceleration Loci. Part 1, Chapter 1, Design Criteria for a Simple Generator and Control System. Referring to Equation 17 in Appendix A, it will be seen that the voice flowed on and on, apparently tireless. Don was interested, intensely so, but he did not understand it. He found himself growing sleepy when the voice suddenly rapped out, "Facsimile, facsimile, facsimile." Costello touched a switch, stopping the voice, and demanded, "Cameras ready? Hot and rolling. Shift." They watched the picture build up. A wiring diagram, Don decided it must be, or else a plate of spaghetti. When the picture was complete, the voice resumed. After more than 2 hours of this, broken only by desultory conversation, Don turned to Isabel. "I'm not doing any good here, and I'm certainly not learning anything. What do you say we leave?" "Suits." They went down the ramp and headed for a tunnel that led toward living quarters. On the way, they ran into Phipps, his face glowing with happiness. Don nodded and started to push on past. Phipps stopped him. "I was just going to hunt you up." "Me?" "Yes, I thought you might want this for a souvenir." He held out the ring. Don took it and examined it curiously. There was a very tiny break in one branch of the H where the enamel had been eaten away. The framing circle was an empty, slightly shadowed groove, a groove so narrow and shallow that Don could hardly catch his fingernail in it. "You've no more use for it?" "It's squeezed dry. Keep it. You'll be able to sell it to a museum someday for a high price." "No," said Don. "I reckon I'll deliver it to my father. Eventually." And we'll follow this high-tech resistance movement next time.